Welcome to Parallax Sangha, our bi-weekly public event. Today we're going to talk about the Beast 666, Aleister Crowley. Really, we're going to talk mostly about magic and what is magic. Tom is my partner in crime at Parallax-Magazine and the head of Parallax-Magazine, and has a lot of experience in researching magic. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before me and Tom and Owen begin our trialogue about magic. We have Raven Connolly coming to talk about gender envy in a couple of weeks. That's our next public event. We have a new meditation group called the Parallax Digital Monastery, and it's going to be every Saturday at 8:30. So if you want to come along and meditate with us, everybody is welcome. We have a men's group, a study group, a film group. We organize various meetups in different European cities. We're growing and we're growing strong, but we could always use your support. So if you want to buy us a coffee, make a one-time donation, or even join the community, then that would be awesome. Let's start, Tom, with the question of magic with a K, right? This is Crowley's invention, even though it's an archaic spelling, I think. But he brought in this idea of magic as a K. So what is that, and what is magic in general?
Oh my goodness, what is magic in general?
Yeah.
No, I think it's a technique to I think the classical Crowleyan definition of magic is the art and science to change a world according to thy will. I think that's the basic idea.
Yeah, he says, "Do what thou will shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will." It's kind of his mantra, or his big phrase that he says all the time in his letters and
right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
no, but it's a mixture. It's a compendium of psychotechniques, I could say, to change your perspective on your world and yourself, and try to give a bend a little bit to it. That's how I would approach it. It's an art and science from his point of view.
Mm-hmm. So how do you practice it? How do you practice magic?
Well, I mean, I think the most interesting thing is that, you always should look as a historian onto magic. It's like you shouldn't colonize it with your ego. It's like it's not something you should talk about, because it's something that in the best case scenario you just do, right? And so, and as it is a hermetic or occult practice, right? And that means half of it is always unknown. We talked about in our podcast about this. Mm-hmm. and so I think there's a dual aspect of this hermetic nature of magic, and one is silence, basically. So there are always things you can't talk about, and there are things you shouldn't talk about. And silence is one of the most important techniques magic has to offer.
So how does that silence differ than, let's say, the silence you would do in let's say Zen meditation or something like that? Or
yeah, well, imagine you wouldn't use your personal pronouns for a month. You wouldn't say I, me, mine. That would change completely the way you look at yourself and the world, right? So, and if you practice meditation and you are silent and you try to interrupt the train of thought, the automatic train of thought that you have, also then like kind of amazing things start to happen. Mm-hmm. And so the basic practice is that of silence, first and foremost.
So then what are we going to talk about tonight, Tom?
No, we're talking about the techniques from a historical or from a technical viewpoint.
I'm teasing. Yeah. What about this question of will? So I guess what you're saying is there's you break the patterns, a bit like Gurdjieff saying break the machine patterns of existence by unusual techniques or unusual behaviors of sort of disruption. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Does that sound like part of, let's say, the definition of magic?
I think everybody is that here has some form of experience in regard of meditation. And so what happens if you concentrate on a certain object or a certain point, then some thoughts will arise up, will try to interrupt your attention. And so the better you getting at focusing and concentrating, the older the memories and the stuff comes up that tries to disturb you. And so with concentration, you try to break the automatic thinking process, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And often, like, especially Crowley, if we're talking about Crowley, because he called himself 666, the beast, etc., right? He was very transgressive.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this like whole left-hand path to magic and stuff like that. Do you want to like talk about that? What's the function of that?
No, I mean,
of transgression. There's, I was looking at quotes from Crowley, and one of the things he said was the key of joy is disobedience.
Right.
And I know that one of the major sort of mantras of Sutric religion, what we talk is obedience, right, to the law, etc. This kind of disobedience, or this kind of breaking down of, you're going against the status quo and that kind of thing, and that seems to be like part of Crowley's whole thing.
Well, I always try to separate Crowley and Magick a little bit from each other, because Crowley is also like a child of his time, right? And so he had like this very strange personality maybe, but then also he had like kind of a role in the tradition that magic or alchemy has for like thousands of years, or like hundreds of years, I think 950 years or so. And so the idea is that magic as a tradition kind of developed, and with the process that Wilber describes as internalization. So things that you seem to observe in the outside, you put that back into the psyche, right? So in Eliphas Levi's times, there was still this concept of ghosts and demons, and even Crowley plays with these kinds of notions. But now with psychology, we know these are kind of ego voices and voices of the self that you can access. And so you see in the whole tradition, in the whole way of alchemy developed into magic, a kind of internalization process. And Crowley played certainly a social role in that context to make it more scientific, right? And to bring also more art into the process. But I would separate those, art and Crowley from each other, because of his weird personality and his transgressive personality.
Right. So it's not necessarily transgressive in that sense. That sense
that
he
was obviously, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think there's something interesting there. Like, you said, Tom, that Crowley was a child of his time. He was there, born at the peak of the British Empire, with its bizarre, very strict morality, but at the same time, it's very strong sadomasochistic underbelly. And I think he was a guy, childhood genius, protege, raised in extremely conservative, not evangelical, I forget what it was exactly, but like very conservative Christian.
It was the Mormon Tabernacles or something
like this.
Yeah.
And he erupted against it. And his intuition was profound. I think, he is in a sense a son of Nietzsche. Like Crowley understood, he was writing in the early 20th century that we're entering this new age, the age of Horus, he called it, where we are going to have to learn to be much more androgynous creatures. For example, one of the things he wrote was that in the previous historical eras, there was much more of a strong sense, say, that like men were men and women were women. He intuited right at the start of the 20th century that this century and the next ones were going to be ones where sexuality was brought into a much more, you might say, fluid androgynous state. And if you just look at what's happened in the last 100 years, that's exactly what has happened. with the birth of the mass LGBT movements, with the birth of the like transgender stuff, with the popularity of tantra and tantric sexuality in the later half of the 20th century. So in that sense, I kind of see him as a crazy prophet of the types of, you might say, new types of pathos that were going to be unleashed in the 20th century. And kind of, he really stuck his fingers into the plug and was like, I'm in this massive empire and I'm going to fucking blow up this nuclear bomb and launch it onto the world. And that, I think, accounts for his massive influence, say, within the 1960s and the counterculture and so on and so forth.
Yeah, sure. He's really a figure, perhaps responsible for the 60s in many ways, like yeah, in a way, like one of the big figures responsible for it, at least in England. You know, we always talk about the beatniks or something in the 1950s, but there's all kinds of things that people don't know about that were going on in like the 20s, you know, that were pretty wild. Yeah, what about this business of sex magic, right? Because this is another one of his terms. We talked about magic, but then there's sex magic,
right?
Is that the same thing as tantra, and what's the difference? And you know, we're talking about tantra and also just the breakdown of gender, right, is one thing, but then sex magic, maybe that's another thing. Maybe they're not the same. I mean, maybe the pathology is different than the art, or maybe the art is making use of the pathology.
Well, sex magic stems basically, if I'm not wrong, like from Austin Osman's sphere, and Crowley was heavily influenced by this. And so this guy had this crazy idea to, you know, access the subconscious and charge the images that you produce with, you know, let's say evolutionary energy.
Let's say. No, but what does that mean? What does that, you know, you want to go, you don't want to elaborate on that?
He jacked off of pictures.
Jacking off to pictures. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's not particularly radical or new. What's the sex magic?
No, but no, the idea that, you know, it's through techniques of trance, you get in a certain kind of state where you elicit some pictures and images coming up, and then you can kind of connect to the evolutionary impulse and charge these archetypal images with energy. So you will, you know, in the hope that you bring these kinds of energies into life and into the world.
Mm-hmm.
That's at least one notion of sex magic. Mm-hmm.
Well, I have another quote from Crowley here. It says, "I have written this book." This is about his book on magic, "to help the banker, the pugilist, the biologist, the poet, the navy, the grocer, the factory girl, the mathematician, the stenographer, the golfer, the wife, the consul, all the rest, to fulfill themselves perfectly, each in his or own proper function." Like, he wanted to bring magic to everybody. He had this crazy ambition. Which is very curious, and he wanted to impress the scientists. He sort of attracted all these bizarre people around him, and he still kind of seems to attract very out there people. But he sort of wanted magic to be mainstream.
Yeah, I don't really know what's going on there, you know, because you have like with Crowley, you have always like this three kind of aspects. You have him, what we talked about as this this person which is right at the brink of a new age, you know, when everything blew up, that what Owen just described. Then you have more the technical aspect, you know, the techniques of magic, which he devoted lots of his time to. And then you had, you know, the whole moral code that he kind of channeled, this Liber Alve Legis, where he laid out the moral and ethical and metaphysical foundations for the next 2,000 years or so, he thought, right? And so it's a little bit difficult to disentangle all this, because all of this kind of belongs together, and then not really, you know, because magic is not for everybody. But that what he said about the nature of man and woman, let's say every man and woman is a star, so everybody has to find their true self. That is something, you know, everybody should engage in his kind of view. So it's a little bit difficult, you know. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I mean the star image. Every man and woman is a star. It seems to have a kind of double meaning to me. It's like, on one sense, is like now everybody wants to be a star on internet, and that's the kind of vulgarization of that. It's like total egohood.
Yeah.
And maybe people took Crowley in that way on some level. And then there's almost like the quote I read you almost is like Marxist. It's almost each according to his need, or it's almost saying like we have to discover our own intense individuality within the archetype that we're embedded in,
right?
Or something like that.
Yeah, well, he had, which is so interesting, because if you look at the works of Ken Wilber, let's say Integral Psychology, and then you look, at Liber 777. So the structure of those books is from Crowley. It's very much the same. You have like a developmental model or approach or frame set, and you attribute diverse things to it. And so his idea, he used a very like a proto form of a developmental model. And so like all the grades you could go through, and they're very, very much resemble the developmental stages that we have now. And so if you look at the centerpiece in that model, that I think what we would describe now as integral, it's called Tiferet, and it's symbolized by the sun. It's the deep self in a kind of way, or higher self, whatever language you use. And so when he talks about every man and woman is a star, that also refers to that kind of more deeper structure beneath the superficial array of behaviors and thought.
Kind of like the individuated self that Jung talked about.
Autonomous self. Yes.
Autonomous self and
But he was keen of using like metaphors drawn from the natural sciences. So we talk about the inertia of the universe, and a man or a woman who's, I forget the exact formulation, but I think who has done their practice right or something, has the entire inertia of the universe behind them. And so that obviously connects to this sense of astral bodies being in their own orbit. Like the sun is kind of on its own course. Nothing's knocking it out of its course. And I think this is where, again, I think it's interesting to historicize Crowley a bit and see him very much as a child of romanticism, but also of the Enlightenment and this kind of utopian hope of liberating people. Even though you can then see tensions within his own writing, there's other points in his own writing, for example, where he's extremely despondent of the masses and says, they're not capable of magic, they're not capable of art, they're not even capable of religion. And yet there's other points, right, where he's saying that magic can potentially liberate everybody. I think it's interesting that this is a tension that seems, through my reading, to run through 20th and 21st century occultism still, right up into the hippie movements and the New Age movements. Is this something that's a liberation thing for everybody, and everybody can be their authentic true self with these practices? Or is this something that actually is secret, is occult in the real meaning of the word, is dangerous? I think certainly in the conversations in our communities that are emerging around Sutra and Tantra, there is a kind of heading towards this sense of, no, the occult, the esoteric is not for everybody. There's a reason why it's occult. And I do stick by that opinion precisely because I think guys like Crowley and guys like Nietzsche, it's really fucking explosive. Like over summer, I was reading a lot of Crowley and doing a lot of practices and fucking felt like I was going a bit insane. So you have to be careful with it.
I really like that, if I can chime in, because of the science thing that you just mentioned, because we talked a little bit about integration of that which was looked at outside. So for example, the thing that we think the world is outside of us, but it is indeed the boundary that our consciousness creates between interior and outer self, that we create, that the consciousness itself creates, right? So the image of the idea that there's a boundary between me and the outside self that might be there, but for my conscious, it's self-created. And so in talking about the sun, there's this concept of autopoiesis that came up. And autopoiesis is the idea that there are self-generating processes. right? In nature, in consciousness, and social systems. And so one element, like A creates B, creates C, creates A again. And so you have a circle. And so the idea in this, in a scientific article I read about the sun is that the sun is basically also self-replicating and self-stabilizing celestial body, let's say, because it regulates itself by pressures and by heat. And when a certain gas is burned, then it blows up a little bit and goes into the next stage where another kind of gas can be burned. And so over the course of thousands and thousands of years, it kind of regulates itself from the inside. And so the idea that our self is not a thing within ourselves, but the way that we are regulating ourselves. Right. And so, for example, that nobody is responsible for the emotions that I have or the thoughts that I have. I'm completely, if I want to be autonomous, I have to take full responsibility and about my internal being and my internal processing, and without being nihilistic or something like this, to enact as an autonomous autopoietic being. And so this is something we can strive for, right? And so you have the idea that a scientific idea like autopoiesis that we can use, and it very much overlays with ideas of magic and self-regulation and disrupting the thought patterns that kind of elicit automatic responses from us. Mm-hmm. Did it make any sense? Or
I love that idea of self as processes of self-regulation.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I've not heard it phrased that way before, but that's brilliant.
Yeah, I was thinking about the paradox as you were speaking of sort of individuality, right? That in an ultimate sense, it doesn't really exist, but then, but then in the relative sense, the people who are the greatest magicians are also the greatest individuals. They have the most individuality. So often people are talking about sort of, tribopoiesis these days. We're talking a lot about the individual and the fact that we're multiple selves. And Gurdjieff said that man is legion. We're not just one, and there is no such thing as just one. But at the same time, there's this paradox that the person who realizes the legion or the multiple selves is the most individual. Does that make any sense?
Sure.
So I think what is interesting about Crowley to me is as a person is his intense individuality. Like just there's just nobody like him. So that kind of defines a crazy wisdom master or a magician. Whether you think he's good or bad, there's a lot of controversy in his life, but just his intense individuality.
What I find so interesting with Crowley is that that he's not peddling magic. He did not occupy or colonize it with his ego. It's like, oh, I have this new form of magic. No, it's like the first 40 or 50 years of his life, he was a man of the world. I mean, he was like a fantastic mountain climber, and he traveled the world, and he was a poet, and he was a writer, and he did all of those things. A chess player, I think. And out of all of these experiences, he kind of condensed this kind of this system from, but he was not branding it for ego purposes, right? And that's what I find so interesting.
But if you read his radical statements about himself, you might think that he was, right?
Right.
His radical claims about his being the only one of beginning a new epoch and being a sort of he kind of marketed himself as a savior figure or the leader of a new world religion, though, didn't he? I mean,
Nietzsche did too, no?
Yeah, Nietzsche did too, yeah.
So Nietzsche was kind of right. What do you do? I mean, like let's look at it from an abstract point of view. It's like what do you do if you're Nietzsche? It's like when you are at the brink of everything and you know it. And it's not just, you're not just a singular being. It's like with the opinion. It's like, culture wants to achieve something through you. And Nietzsche knew that, and he expressed it. What do you do? It's like, I think that's such a weird experience to have.
I think maybe that's good to compare Nietzsche and Crowley, because they both represent this kind of the Antichrist in a sense, right? The end of Christianity, and they both have a different style of doing that.
No, they represent Dionysos. That's something else.
Dionysius, yes, but Nietzsche, claimed to be the Antichrist at the end of his life, and Crowley said, "I am the beast 666." It was a radical attack on Christianity, even though that he uses Christian stuff in his practices, and so I wouldn't say he's fully anti-Christian either. But my point is, my point is that that in a way, Aleister Crowley had a system and a method and he worked with many communities, and he did things, and he had relationships with people, whereas Nietzsche was alone on his mountain. Nietzsche's book was almost like Zarathustra, almost like feels like there's a tragic element, more of a tragic element to Nietzsche, whereas Aleister Crowley seems to have achieved many of his aims because he was not acting on his own. That's my sense anyway, or that he was working with real traditions rather than just trying to do it on his own.
What I like about the comparison between those two is that for Nietzsche, there was an original equilibrium from Apollonian and Dionysian.
Yes.
And so with Platon, it kind of got skewed in one way. And so we developed a very Apollonian culture. And so a culture with order and a culture with theoretical models and science and all of this. And the Dionysian aspect got kind of pushed away. And so what he tried to do was to bring Dionysos and the joy and the chaos and the equilibrium back.
Yeah.
But in the kind of way, that's exactly what Crowley wanted to do.
Yeah, and that's what's so appealing about Crowley, or in a sense. Yeah.
But it's not just chaos, it's not just Dionysian, it's the equilibrium that is, and the joy. And so also there you find, one of the main ethical points of the Liber Alve Legis is just enjoy the life. And if you're not enjoying, then you're doing something wrong, actually, right? Mm-hmm. And so you should bring, but it's not just the dumb joy. It's a joy that stems from the equilibrium between those two forces. You have to, in the words of Nassim Taleb, you have to be anti-fragile. How do you do that? And then you bring yin and yang together again, and have like this kind of barbell strategy. You have the order, but you have your techniques to invoke the Dionysian.
But the deep joy, I guess Nietzsche said, joy is deeper than woe, or something like that, right? This kind of, but it's not just a superficial, as you say, it's not a kind of surface joy. It's not just gaiety or, nihilistic joy of destruction. It's right. A ritualized. Like Crowley created all these rituals, didn't he? These ritual spaces for doing these things, right? He was trying to create the Greek temples in a way, or the where that kind of Dionysian had a container. I think Nietzsche found the Dionysian, but he didn't have a container, and that kind of destroyed him. I know many people would disagree with that.
I've got to say, I agree mostly with the conclusions that Andrew is drawing here. I think it's totally right to view Crowley as, like I said, a son of Nietzsche, and he's working 30, 40 years after Nietzsche. But he does say Nietzsche is a prophet, and I think his Zarathustra is very much a prophetic text for what we're doing. They are both clearly sensing an absence of Dionysian energy in culture and exploding it, whether it's with drugs or with sexuality or with vibrant poetry or saying things that nobody else would say. As I said earlier, I think they do both remain slightly sons of the Romanticism and the Enlightenment. They don't have the knowledge of psychoanalysis. They don't have the knowledge of anthropology. They don't have also the awareness of nuclear weapons that we have in the 20th century now and the 21st century now. And that means, I think it's, for me at least, it's important to approach both of these guys through this later knowledge system and think, okay, there was amidst their work, and you have to also admit there's lots of contradictions in these guys' work. It's very hard to draw a coherent philosophy or a coherent system, I think. But we have to look at them, but then also ask, where are their shortcomings? So, for example, this idea of like will being the law. I forget the precise formulation again. Well, one of the big the insights of psychoanalysis is very difficult to trust when we're really being authentic to our will. It's very hard to know when it's your conscious and whether it's your unconscious speaking. And I subscribe to this view. I think esotericism itself has to be rethought through a kind of rejoinded pessimism. That means we have to be more careful, and we can't just go straight into this affirmative Dionysian that I think is what Nietzsche and what Crowley were getting towards. And I think even if you look, say, at the countercultural movements, the 1960s, which, as Andrew said, I think a lot of that implicitly or explicitly draws influence from Crowley. A lot of that did spiral out into acid casualties. A lot of that failed to really make a serious like political impact. It like produced people, sure, at the level of politics, but a lot like people sold out on the ideals or stayed as hippies and remained in the cultural underground. I think, for me at least, one of the questions with the work that we're engaged in at the moment is to kind of take some of the currents that have been bubbling through the underground for 60 plus years, but try to mature them a little bit and make them a bit more able to interact, say, at the cultural level at large, rather than just being a constant state of rebellion and getting away. And I think that is what, whether or not they intended it, I think that is to an extent the legacy of Crowley, and indeed Nietzsche too, is a kind of such an intense antinomianism, you can say, that it needs to be balanced with something else. Here I'm very much with Thomas Hammelrick about the need for sutra and tantra, for example, which I think these guys don't really get so much or communicate so much.
I agree with you in terms of Nietzsche. I'm not sure if I would agree with you in terms of Crowley, because if I look at his system, you have to go through different grades and stages of understanding, and that's the way to do it. I don't know how good his system is, and I don't know how well it works. I'd say there's probably flaws within that system because he was such a pioneer. But the difference between him, I think I would agree with that in terms of Nietzsche. But I think he did absorb psychoanalysis, and I think that mysticism goes way deeper than psychoanalysis. This is kind of maybe an argument we have, like when Freud says that the mystical state is the oceanic state. He got that from a mystic who was trying to argue against him, and he called that an infantile state rather than a state of great intelligence. And he considered that to be a regression, and that's where I disagree with Freud. And that's where I disagree with, at least the Freudian. I think Freud was very good at describing the pleasure principle, and that was extremely accurate. And I think that was, that's like sutra, right? But I think you'd have to go into Crowley or other people to get to the next step. And I don't think Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche was already at the last step, but he didn't have the sutra. That's how I see it anyway. I'm sorry.
I think
rambling here.
I think that it's the philosophy. Like, I think maybe Crowley's system of grades and system was more systematic than Nietzsche's, but the philosophy underneath that if everybody is just living in accordance with their will, certainly that's a very dangerous thing to misinterpret. And I don't even know if it's politically tenable.
But his statement is not will to power. His statement is love under will. It's not will to power. It's a little bit different than Nietzsche's statement. There's love in there, which is not, Anyway.
Please, Tom.
Go ahead, Tom. Yeah.
I think, to your point, I think, they don't know the atom bomb and the plights that we have now in our culture, but there's also something lost that they have or had that we don't have anymore.
Mhm.
Right? And so we live, and I think we talked about this, we live in an age of touristification. You know, it's just one example. When you want to go to Berlin, you just have your phone, right? And then you go to Berghain or whatever you do. There's no risk involved or chaos. There's nothing. You just book a ticket with Ryanair for 30 euros. Then you fly over. 2 hours later, you are in the center of Berlin. Great, right? Pleasurable, perfect, right? But they lived in a time where there was no touristification. You know, when you actually, if you want to go to Paris or to Tangier,
Or climb K2 like he did actually,
K2,
like he
that
climbed
was-
Everest.
they had skin in the game with everything, you know, especially a figure like him or even Hemingway. You know, they had skin in the game. And so the skin in the game is very important, that you are accountable for your actions. It's, you know, they didn't have the iPhones, you know, they didn't have the internet, you know, and so communication was way slower in a kind of sense. And so the will, that what we understand now with will, is probably not what they understood it, right? And I think, you know, if you take into account, you know, the harmonization of, you know, Apollonian and Dionysian aspects, and, you know, breaking off the in silence and breaking off the automatical kind of thinking patterns, and then you might probably discover something deeper, you know, and why the hippie movement didn't realize it to its full potential, I can't tell you, but I probably would say that our understanding of what it is now is different, and our way of living now is different than what Crowley experienced.
Yeah, I mean, he climbed the biggest mountain in the world at that time, for example, you know, and risked death. You know, he was a great mountain climber. I mean, it seems to me this kind of heroic figure it's hard to be that in this particular time. Maybe it's possible. I don't know.
Yeah, he actually went into the desert, you know, and meditated there.
But the other thing that strikes me about Crowley that we don't have in our contemporary society, even though we have atom bombs and the internet, is poetry. I mean, he was just such a fantastic wordsmith. Like the way he used language and words, that seems to be a kind of, and this, the magical quality of invocation of certain phrases and words and that kind of thing is that's something that people have a hard time doing these days. We have to go back to find that, I think, the people like him or other people, you know, Shakespeare or whatever. But
that was this proper British, was it King's English? No, but it was like this proper Eton, Cambridge English that Russell Brand and Boris Johnson and these kind of folks still speak.
And Owen Cox, you know.
Oh yes, well yes.
You can do that.
You have to talk properly when doing it.
Yeah. Owen's a classicist too. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, to go on like this, I do think, you know, both these guys, Crowley and Nietzsche, obviously understand the need for a balancing of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. I think also they both understood that their role in history had to be explosive Dionysian forces. Yeah. I think, however, that neither knew, like Tom was saying, that we were going to have mass media cultures and mass information transmitting and a degree of... So for example, to give a concrete example, like I come from the heavy metal scene, and I think one of the ways to read the heavy metal scene is a kind of rolling Crowleyan tantra that's kind of still going on in the underbelly.
Mm-hmm,
like Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page was very consciously working with Crowley. Black Sabbath, I don't know if they were like consciously working with Crowley, but they were certainly tapping into the British occult revival, which he and Dion Fortune really helped spearhead. So there's all that stuff going on. And then obviously heavy metal is the horror aesthetic, monsters and demons and lots of drugs and lots of sex, which is like what Crowley was into. It's mostly a kind of impotent force. It's a lot of fun, but it stays just in this antinomian stance. And that was what I was getting at, I think. And similarly, you could say with Nietzsche that most people, or a lot of people who end up reading Nietzsche, are like, the caricature is frustrated young men, and there's a reason for that caricature. He really gives you like a masculine, like, fuck you, but they're antinomian stance. Yes, Egil. But I think there's a dialectical move. I guess that's what I'm saying. And for me, that is bringing psychoanalysis into the question. That is looking at the capacity for self-deception and self-destructiveness, which is what Freud's trying to formulate in the Death Drive. That I think both of these guys, with their focus on affirmation, we can misinterpret it and kind of get caught up in our own self-destructive spirals, and then end up, like I said, with something like, I think, the heavy metal movement, which isn't really going anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the thing about the antinomian thing is like, why are you doing that? And what's the motivation? And are you doing that just to have a trip, you know? And there's so many casualties of that kind of behavior that you know, it's not worth it for most people.
And if your philosophy is that every man and woman should follow their own will and morals are just there for the weak and should be broken, it's easy to see how you end up there. I'm coming across a little bit as the Jordan Peterson moralist.
You're coming across as the moralist here.
Yeah, I know, which is an unusual role for me.
Usually we're the other, like, usually I'm kind of like, because Gurdjieff, for example, you know, who was a contemporary of Crowley, who I'm extremely fond of, and I know his work much better than Crowley. I was listening to somebody talk about Gurdjieff, say that Gurdjieff is unappealing to people because Gurdjieff just gives you the bad news, right, all the time. Whereas the difference between him and Crowley is Crowley gives you all this fun, you know, so you don't get the bad news as much. I mean, you have to go through hell no matter what, you know, in those processes, like, you know, Crowley certainly experienced that, you know, you have to wrestle with the beast of your own ego and of the world and that kind of thing. But this colorfulness and this experimentation and this art is not as present in Gurdjieff, even though Gurdjieff is a very, you know, he teaches, I think, forget psychoanalysis, go to Gurdjieff. That's my opinion. But you know, you could learn a lot more about yourself doing that. That's just my opinion. We could argue about that, but in any case, that's just my feeling that this whole sort of, yeah, the glee. I agree with you that the glee and the fun and the experiment, you know, definitely leads to a very dark place, and it did in culture, and so did Crowley. I mean, who became a heroin addict, and both of his wives drank themselves to death, and you know, you can't look at him and say, oh, you know, this guy was, you know, a great guy or anything. You know, you can look at him as an individual and say, this guy was driven by something else, like superhuman, that I don't really understand.
I like the point you bring in about art. Like, I think, again, we're talking a lot about both of them. Nietzsche and Crowley both come out of high culture and have a massive cultural impact. And we're at a point now in 2020 where we've completely lost high culture. High culture doesn't exist. We really live in the age of the vulgar. You know, most people don't even have a concept that there is TV or film outside of Netflix anymore. And Netflix just makes its stuff based on data of what they know people like. That's the state of culture. And I'm not saying these guys are to blame at all for that, but we have to look at the intense cultural forces that have moved through the last 100 years. And I think try to start to shift it a little bit, I suppose, is what I'm going on. And so it needs, I suppose what I think I'm saying is we need a better interpretation of the prophets of the 20th and the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's complicated. Because I think, you know, I'm always hesitant to talk about prophets in this kind of way, because it's like, it's our way of making stories of these kind of weird events. And like even developmental models, I really like them, but it's our way of understanding or Hegelian dialectics. That's just a story that we tell ourselves to make the chaos more graspable in a kind of sense. And I think that's if we're talking about magic, that's very important, because there's always something, and we talked about this in our podcast, no, that there's always something that is occult and always will be, and to have some epistemic humility to acknowledge that we can use certain models, and then we can use certain theories and philosophies or psychological approaches, but this is also only half of the equation, and the other half is always dark. And so what we can do is try to approach this darkness and this chaos with an open mind, I guess. And the same is true for Crowley and Nietzsche as well. They're like crazy figures, but and it's fun to talk about them. But I don't know how fruitful that is, actually.
How fruitful it is to talk about them?
No, yeah, it's just it's anecdotes. It's fun,
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I think we can learn from.
I don't know if
prophecy is an insult, right? I was listening to something about what the meaning of prophecy was. It doesn't mean to predict the future. What the prophets were in the past, in ancient Israeli times, when there were tons of prophets, everywhere, and they were like all over the place, and they would go into ecstatic states, and they would speak things, and people would listen to them, and what they did was they insulted they insulted your sense of yourself. They were social critics. They weren't predicting the future. Those were divinators. The people who did divination predicted the future, but the prophets were bands of crazy people who would just sort of get into states and speak the truth to you, right? So we don't want to hear that. And this is somehow, I think that when I listen to when I read about Crowley or Nietzsche or some of the crazy wisdom masters of the East that I love, Gurdjieff, etc., that's the feeling I get. It's like, I want to know that something true about myself, right? I don't want the bullshit, entertainment anymore. So prophecy is an insult. That's how I define prophecy. And so it's not easy to digest these people. And they don't want it to be easy for you to digest them. They want to insult your status quo.
Yeah, and they created a huge shadow, that looms still, that shadow is still large and looms over us. If you look at current gurus, and I mean, even look at the behavior of Carlos Castaneda or Andrew Cohen, it's like all they follow a certain blueprint of, these kind of masters or prophets that kind of were insulting the ego and were kind of playing that game of taking people's possessions and robbing their ego.
It depends if they had an ego themselves, or they were playing, if they were true prophets or fake prophets. I mean, there's probably more fake prophets than true prophets, I mean, most prophets are probably false prophets. But then there's the occasional one that is quite penetrating.
I think like neither Gurdjieff nor Crowley were nice people to their students.
No, that's true. But they were also extremely compassionate and loving. Both are true, actually. The other side is true as well.
No, I think most of their strategies were to disrupt the egos of their disciples, the social strategies. Yeah. And that can backfire very, very easily.
Of course. Yeah, I was listening to Alan Watts talk about Gurdjieff, and he was saying that what Gurdjieff did was he got all these people together and made them do these weird movements and activities, and his whole purpose was to kick them out, and because it was all a big sort of theater to get people to not become some sycophantic guru followers. So they would become sycophantic guru followers. The people who stuck around, in the Gurdjieff movements were actually not the real students. The real students were the ones that had left, which is interesting, I thought.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just, I don't know.
Well, it's interesting even to think like the tension between religion versus, you could say, esoteric self-liberation. that runs again through, I think, both of these figures. Like, I know Nietzsche was very, very vocally critical of Christianity, but as we've been discussing a lot recently, including in the presentation I gave at Cadell's conference on Saturday that people can look up on Philosophy Portal, I think there is really a way. There's no other reader to read Nietzsche in like a text like Zarathustra as an attempt to create a new spiritual text in the legacy of the Judeo-Christian and pagan Western tradition. He's drawing those seams together. He can't get away from it. And similarly, Crowley at points will decry mainstream Christianity and say it's terrible and it's horrible, but then elsewhere say, actually, the Eucharist is one of the most potent occult rituals that we have, and that all we've got is an incredibly emasculated form of Christianity that's completely lost its connection to the original Dionysian elements of Christianity. I mean, he's constantly pointing to the connections between the rituals of Dionysus, between the Egyptian understanding of Osiris being destroyed by Apep and then being brought back into the Ion of Horus. No, I've got that wrong. It's that's the IAO. It's Isis destroyed by Apep and then brought back as Osiris. But he's constantly pointing to these links, constantly. And there's that. I don't think either of these thinkers really resolve that, and that's part of their crazy wisdom status, I guess. It's interesting, Andrew, you're talking about the word prophet. I was reading Harold Bloom recently, and he says that actually the Hebrew word that we translate as prophet, the real meaning is closer to proclaimer, which is like what you're saying. Someone who stands up and proclaims. And I think that is kind of the vibe I get from certainly the more philosophical elements, as opposed to, say, the systematic elements of Crowley. He is fucking banging a drum and trying to wake people up and shake people up, which doesn't always need to be totally coherent.
Yeah, well, that's using mythopoetic language rather than rational language, just to cut through, the images, the stale images that we have. So there is a quote here. He said, "He shall fall down into a pit and there he shall perish with the dogs of reason." For example, this kind of thing he would say. So you can't be a literalist when you're interpreting, twilight language, as they call it in Tibet. This kind of mind breaking language or concept breaking language. You were going to say, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, what they try to do is to re-establish a new kind of meta-narrative or a meta-myth, like a basic approach how we are in the world, basic metaphysical idea about what it means to be alive now. I was thinking about, in preparing and thinking about this talk, I was thinking about how to make magic kind of palpable. And I came, also because of the book from Jeremy Johnson, seeing through the what's the word, the book called, his book on Gapsat. So the idea that when we were, pre-modern men, we looked at the world as cave. That's a metaphorical idea that we have. And so, how much of the time do we actually walk through the world thinking that we are in this world as in a cave? We're doing this most of the times, actually, I think, but you get what I'm saying? So you conceptualize. You
mean in an enclosed space that we're not really.
You encapsulate, you conceptualize the world as the cave, as the womb where you are inside of it. Mm-hmm. You are in the world. You talk about this in this kind of manner. And then if you look, for example, at system theory, so there's this paradigm shift going on, not to view yourself anymore as being in the world, but acting with the world. And so that's a whole different kind of metaphorical and metaphysical kind of conception about who you are and what is your relationship with the world. For example, if you're conceptualizing yourself as being in the cave, as being in the world, as being in the womb, then you can't really do magic, because you don't have any,
skin in the game again.
Skin in the game. Yeah. But if you if you're conceptualizing yourself as being with the world and acting with the world, as let's say, as a metaphor, as husband and wife, where the wife is the world, and you, independently of your gender, you are like the phallic part of it, then you're getting into a relationship, in a dance with the world, and then you can do magic.
That's not being helpless. In other words, it's not being a helpless victim
Right,
of fate and circumstances.
Exactly.
If you're in something, you're trapped, right? You're
Exactly.
Whereas if you're with something, you're in a dance.
Exactly. And so if you look at systems theory and Maturana, and so they talk a lot about this shifting of the paradigm. You're not in this world, you're with this world. You're dancing with this world. And so that very nicely overlays with this idea of magic and this change of the metaphysical ideas, who we are. And so I think Crowley and Nietzsche did a lot of those things, just destroying the old kind of metaphysical ideas about our position in the world and bringing in some new ideas.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good time to open up. That's a good moment to open it up to Q&A, huh?
Yeah, I think so.
Did you have any other
point? And we got a couple of questions in the chat already.
Okay, let me just take away the spotlight and let everybody, so we can see everybody.
I think, Johnny, did you want to ask your question first?
Yes. Can you speak to Crowley's advocacy for white magic opposed to black magic / voodoo?
Can you repeat that again, please?
So can you speak to Crowley's advocacy for white magic opposed to black magic? Because as I've read him a couple of times, and I wouldn't know which section, but he warns for the dark side and black magic to stay away from it. Not that you can work with dark forces through white magic, but just not to practice black magic. He warns, as far as I know, he warns.
Yes.
I think it's not fun to play with the Goetia, if you mean that.
So, but why? So, why would he advocate for it? Because he does pose it as himself as someone that might. I mean, let's say a pious Christian looking at Crowley would think he was into black magic, right?
Yeah,
but that's the nonsense of people who don't understand esotericism.
Yeah, no, sure.
Understanding of black magic is the wrong way to look at it. That's just evil, satanic, blah.
Yeah.
And from what I've read about Crowley on the forms of magic, like in one of his later books, Magic Without Tears, he actually talks about 3 forms of magic: white magic, yellow magic, and black magic. And he says that black magic is purely ego-serving and warns people away from it. He says that yellow magic is the sort of thing practiced by Buddhists and Taoists, which is ultimately trying to sort of bring yourself into a harmony with the state of things without trying to exert too much influence on them. And then he says white magic is the affirmative creative stance that wants bliss and joy and activity and engagement. And he might write about it differently elsewhere, but that's certainly what he says in Magic Without Tears.
Yeah, and if we look at sort of, nuclear, bombs and the sort of the whole 20th century and all the black magic of technology, right? What these occultists were up to was pretty tame compared to actual black magic, I would say, which is just blind and murderous, and do you have any more thoughts about that, Tom?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like Jordan Peterson says, you need to know the beast within you to be a very ethical person and a strong person. And so we have so much deep impulses and dark impulses, and we, our society is structured in a way that we push them down. But these, what the layman would call black magic is the, the intent to, try to integrate those psychological forces and drives and integrate them and kind of master them. I think it's not necessarily bad.
Well, that wouldn't be black magic, Tom. That would be white magic. Black magic would be intentionally inflicting cruelty, through hypnotizing people or turning them into zombies like they do in voodoo culture. Crowley was against black magic.
Andrew, where's the difference between what I said and what you said?
Well, you
There's
just
no
said
difference.
I know, but you were saying that was black magic. But Crowley was against black magic very clearly.
Yeah, but he was for integrating
the shadow. I agreed. Sure, yes, and integrating the beast. He called himself the beast.
If you want to harm somebody, if you want to harm somebody, that's the black thing.
Yeah.
It's the categories mean different things in different conversations, so it's very
sure.
I also realized I just control F'd the paper. I misdescribed Crowley's descriptions of things. So he describes in Magick without this black magic as magic being based in a philosophy that the world is ultimately sorrow. So it's an extreme pessimism. And it's that, I guess he would connect with it, the schools that just want liberation and to escape from the phenomenal world. Whereas then yellow magic would be just kind of being at peace and accepting it as it is, the path of minimal resistance. And then white magic would be affirming it. I think Crowley would, like on this reading, the white magic would be something Dionysian. But I think these categories are so, it's almost like the left and right categories we used to talk about politics. They're so loaded, and there's far more complexity than those three can really give light to.
Yeah. I mean, there's a difference between emerging, integrating the shadow or going into the darkness or discovering the evil intention you have and then acting on it, right? It's like those are different. That was my only point. Like, you can make it. The proper form of doing that is catharsis and theater, expressing the darkness, giving form to that, right? But usually black magic, is something that I don't know. I mean, how I've understood black magic is something where you intentionally kind of abuse somebody, or through hypnosis, or
I think and it's all a misnomer, because I think real magic is not something that you do. I think real magic is something that kind of happens, because at that point you have long deconstructed your ego and yourself, and then you give yourself over to some weird occult generator function of stuff, but it's not something that you do.
Well, I agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the tantric traditions, in deity yoga, when you're doing deity yoga, you're the deity doing it. You're not doing it. I think that's the same thing. Crowley said that he was receiving his writing because he was connecting to a kind of psychic energy. He was connecting to I don't know, some god, right? I forget, one of the so he was connecting to that collective psychic energy, and that was doing the writing, and that was his what he would call his real prophetic writing. Where other things he was doing was sort of like, he was explaining that, or it was commentary on that. But the actual prophetic writing is always comes from a beyond you. It's the idea of will it's like it's kind of a paradox, because it's not you're giving into that energy rather than you're willing that energy. If you're willing that energy, it might be black magic. It might look like white magic. It might be just deceptive and false.
No, I wrote a book about about pre-egoic will, the narcissistic will of the child, then the egoic will and the forms of will, and then the trans-egoic forms of will. And so what happens if you're not identifying as the causal instigator of the will, but how do you get to that point? And that's the question.
Are there more questions before I keep jumping in here? But
Yeah, we had one from Yuri.
Yeah, so if like you spoke of Crowley as being a Dionysian response to an overly Apollonian culture, so like looking at culture today, like is it, I don't see it as being in any aspect, I don't see it as being overly Apollonian or overly Dionysian. In fact, I see it as like underly both, and the mass media and all of that. And so like I'm thinking, what is the proper response to that? Do we like need like a contrarian to what is now, or just like both Apollonian or Dionysian? I just like, yeah.
It's all Apollonian. That's the problem.
You think?
Like you mentioned mass media. It's like they're all tooting the same horn. They're all, it's not that they're not having like big conflicts about the interpretation of a certain event. No, they all chime in on the same events with the same kind of narrative. I mean, like, slightly different, but it's not. There's no, there's where's the chaos? Where's the divergence? Where's like, then we have touristification. Every European city looks more or less the same. Like everywhere Starbucks.
Can you define Apollonian, how you understand it?
Well, order and structure.
control, I guess, is
Control.
Okay.
But at the same time, it's weirdly chaotic too. It's like weirdly like there's just no order and no chaos. It's like there's a layer of order, and then everything's very random. It seems like.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like weird. It's like you cannot like pinpoint what it is.
I think both are extremely decadent. That's the issue. So we've got a very decadent Dionysian, which is everybody on Pornhub and everybody.
That's not Dionysian.
Well, it's an attempt to have Dionysian. It's an attempt to have undifferentiated chaos.
I give you another example. Everybody talks about metamodernism and developmental stage models and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And modernism. That's Apollonian.
Of course it is, but it's decadent Apollonian. It's totally outsourcing Apollonianism to the intellect. That's what we have. That's the Apollonian element of culture. It's like all of our ability to make distinctions are at the level of logic and the concept, and we're very good at that. But the spirit of the age, the spirit of egalitarianism and even democratism, here I'm going to be controversial, right, is totally antithetical to Apollonianism. Apollonianism is all about hierarchy.
Well, maybe we could say there's a positive Apollon, or there's a functional Apollonianism, and then there's a totally psychotic Apollonianism, and same with Dionysian. We have the both sides.
I mean, I give it to Owen is right. It's a perverse version of the Dionysian, because it's like, you know it when it's there. You know it when you're in love. That doesn't happen on purpose. It descends kind of from you, that state. And this true Dionysian state also kind of descends. It's like, it's a weird thing. You can't, I mean, I think you maybe can lay the groundwork for it to appear, but it's like, there were rituals, the rites of Aloysius, where you can kind of create the setup for a Dionysian cult and Dionysian experience, but that what we have now is not a Dionysian culture.
I would say it's like there's a similarity to the Victorian age of Aleister Crowley in the sense that you have a very sort of psycho-rigid society in terms of ideology, and control and global, empire, and at the same time there's this undercurrent of pornography. Like pornography was invented in the Victorian age. Pornography is invented when there's repression. So there's this sort of paradox.
Well, I think like you got to confront the fact that the leading cultural influence has been American culture, which is Puritanism, and we're still stuck in that. Yeah,
and Puritanism is sort of Apollonianism. It's the attempt to get rid of the feminine.
Neurotic
it's the attempt to totally destroy the feminine, or kill the feminine.
There's
And
not a constructive dance between the Apollonian and the Dionysian at
No,
all. And the
no.
symptom of that is that every Dionysian space, if you ask people going, like, a random person on the street going to it, it's escapism. That's how they think of it. And that the moment I think the Dionysian is being thought of as escapism, something's gone wrong.
Right.
And I don't want to be anti-Christian, but because Ivan Illich would say that corruption of the best is the worst. There's something very deep and beautiful and profound in Christianity, but the dark side of Christianity is this very good evil duality, right? So there's God, and then there's the devil, and God is the Apollonian, and the devil is the Dionysian. Whereas in a more balanced society, let's say, in a proper, like in India, for example, when you have Shiva and Shakti, and you go into the temple and you have ecstasies in front of Shiva, and then you go back to your ordered house, and so there's always you're always going back and forth. Whereas I think that I think the Puritan society is an attempt to repress the Dionysian, which leads to just Pornhub, right? Kind of this ennui of everything. Everything is permitted and nothing is real.
Exactly. I mean, it's like even the 7-day work week is a Protestant and idea, and so then you can't even flirt on the workspace anymore. So what do? Of course, you go to Pornhub.
Yeah, right.
That's the best critique of today's world I have ever heard. You can't flirt in the workspace.
Yeah, it's terrible.
That's something very terrible. I agree. It's like just something
So Victorian.
I teach at Science Upon. I just took this test that I had to take. I had to take this like a test, and it was like behaviors. It was so Victorian. It was like trying to, and there was a right answer and a wrong answer, right, about how to behave in each case, and it was all like multiple choice. What do you do when you're in this situation? And you go to the police, or it's like there's no humanity there. It's like it's absolutely rigid, and so that's why it's interesting to look at Crowley, because he's so the opposite of that. Or and then think about Magick, and then think about how to break these reified states.
And it is interesting to look at the moments in culture when, say, the ideas of guys like Crowley were really big and what they were producing. Like, look at the 60s and the 70s, the movies, the fashion, the music. Even though it did fizzle out, it's fucking weirdly horny compared to the standards of today.
Yeah, and they genuinely experienced the Dionysian, I think.
Yeah,
in the 60s.
it's super Dionysian.
They really experienced that, but we don't have that. In a very destructive and
saxophones
sort of, all kinds of stuff, all kinds of things going on, which nothing's going on right now in some ways. I mean, except right here at Parallax Sangha, of course.
I mean, probably on this conversation, this is where perhaps about a year ago in the IDW, there was a bringing in of the third concept of the Sibelian, which is just being in the worship of the Great Mother, which is just a state of kind of ugly undifferentiation. It doesn't even fuck.
Yeah, I would say it's not the Apollonian. I agree with that. We're not in the Apollonian. We're not in Apollonian is like empire. It's like Napoleon or something.
Yes.
That's Apollonian.
Greek
We're
Empire.
not in the Apollonian. We're in something else. Yeah, we're not in the Dionysian either. Yeah, I think that is a good analysis to say we're in the Sibyllian.
But we've outsourced the Apollonian to the intellect. So conceptually, we can be very precise and very distinct.
Or
but
to
it's
the
those
machine.
hilarious paradoxes where we've never had a better understanding of how evolution and sexual reproduction work, and at the same time we're incredibly ideological about actually acknowledging those facts in our day-to-day life.
The youth isn't fucking anymore. That's the point. If you look at the stats, the young people are not fucking anymore. That's super weird.
That's very weird, isn't it? Especially when they have so much access and potential, and the Moors are there's no Victorian Moors anymore, except there is, but it would appear that there isn't.
No, but again, like in the 70s, I know the story from books and from my parents, and they were fucking. It was like a big party, and I still remember. It's a weird anecdote, but it's like the neighbors of my parents. So they made a big party, and they painted the interior of their whole house black. I mean, imagine that you're making a party and you paint your house black, and then everybody has a go at it. It's like this was the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Who does that anymore?
Yeah.
Tom, can I ask you another question I have in the chat? It's a bit of a scramble, but I just perhaps can get some bit of education, the educational value of Crowley in there. And I ask about his work in the Book of Thoth, which is, he speaks to all the Thoth. Yes,
Thoth.
yes.
Thanks.
Anyway, so because I really love that self-regulating autopoietic like vision of the sun, A, B, C, D, right? And that you go to different phases in your individuation process as a person in life. And if you study each card every day, and you go, so study that image and try to identify with it, embody it. I think learning to live with those different archetypal figures and energies and invoke them helps you basically know yourself in a better way. And also in addition to that, I think also his book, the Book of Lies, also advocating for secrecy and silence, but also attention just to play with the truth, your own personal truth, because it changes. It's the great coming and going constantly, right? Of sensations, of feelings, and of perceptions as well. So just to come to my question, and also like that you were saying that Crowley was channeling his culture. Wasn't he also just teaching how to create a spectacle for oneself to live through these different forces that are at play, and if you're aware of them and are able to invoke them at your will, that you can actually have a sense of power over reality. I
don't think we can have like a sense of power over reality. I think like
power over is the wrong word. Wrong way to put it.
Yeah. Because can I just say one more thing? Because for me, I would say black magic would be to influence someone else's self-regulating power. So to actually to cast a spell, or to take some of their let's say DNA, and then work on their field, and then have others perhaps work on it at the same time, and then obstructing their self-regulating autopoietic being in the world. So, and I would just say that white magic is that you understand your own self-regulating tendencies, and that you can invoke certain, let's say, energies and archetypical forces to just gather yourself and be able to meet the day and reality in a way that is beneficial to whatever goal you're pursuing.
I mean, I always make the joke. It's like, try to meditate for 2 hours without moving your body. That's all what is. It's like if you're having an asana and you try to concentrate, and after 30 minutes the pain will start, and you try to concentrate, and then the emotional pain will start, and you want to leave the meditation, but you keep sitting there for 90 minutes, for 120 minutes, maybe for 3 hours. If you can do that, that's it. You don't need anything else. This is self-regulation. This is being in the world. This is confronting your demons. It's like, because the thing with magic, it's all, all these kind of things that can confuse, but it's really about these fundamentals. Just sit in the meditation for 3 hours without moving, and having one thought, one mantra, without any other images or thoughts about your bank account or your lover, what your father said when you were 13. Just one thought, one thing.
That's very difficult to do.
No, it's very.
If you could do that, then you wouldn't need all these other techniques, right? but we do need all these techniques because that's almost impossible to do. In my experience, because I've done 40-day Zen retreats where we sat for 18 hours a day in silence. And
Right.
there was just nothing but chaos going on in my mind the whole day long, right? I couldn't
Right.
do that in 18 hours. And then in 40 days, I still couldn't do it. I was a little better after 40 days.
Yeah, but it's palpable. A meditation is palpable. The pain, the chaos, the emotional drag, that's palpable. It's different than to play with, no offense, tarot cards, because then you have like all these kind of things. Your interpreter like thinks this and you do this. No, just sit and concentrate and try to,
I think you have to do both. I think you have to have an interpretive heuristic. At least, see, this is what Krishnamurti used to say to everybody. It's like, just be and like, it's just the mind. But the problem with that is that nobody could do that. You just give somebody the absolute and they can't handle it. So that's why you need all these other things.
Right.
Why you need all these other techniques and you need to do psychology. And, this is where I might agree with Owen, that you need to go through a psychoanalytical process, because just meditating through it doesn't work for most people. It works for rare people. Sometimes it works.
Right.
Yeah. But, I agree with you. If you could do that, then you wouldn't need all the bells and whistles and costumes and mantras and yogas and.
No, that's why people like Luther and Crowley and Gurdjieff and Nietzsche were giants of the will. And that's because they could focus all the energies on some point, and they could indulge in all these crazy theories in a kind of way, because every once in a while there is a black swan, like a person who has this kind of mastery about will.